You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast, a place for real conversations with people who love someone with the disease of addiction. Now here is your host, Margaret Swift Thompson.
Welcome back to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast. Today, I continue my conversation with Will Thatcher. In this episode, Will shares with us the journey of writing Killing Hurt, his first ever addiction fiction novel that will resonate with any of you in recovery from a substance use disorder or as a family member. It was quite an adventure to read Killing Hurt. Let's get back to Will.
The Embrace Family Recovery Podcast.
Along the trajectory of gathering this great information and sharing your story and journaling, you decided one day, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a novel about a guy or a couple of guys in recovery, and I'm going to include recovery in the story.
So I have heard, I don't know, let's make up a number and say 150 great YouTube qualifications. I've heard thousands of great stories in the rooms. I've read a number of really good memoirs, all the true stuff, and it's all awesome. And of course, we've all seen dozens of, or at least aware of dozens of movies that have sober characters and sober themes. It just seemed like a gap in the universe for like what I'm interested in, which is fiction. And so I started thinking about that, and I was like, what happened actually is my sponsor started taking acting classes like a year ago.
That's awesome.
And we were sitting down at the diner after the meeting. He's telling us about this. Gosh, I'm so jealous that he's got this creative outlet. And he goes and he does this thing, and he didn't have any expectations for it. He just, was doing it for fun. I was like, wait a minute, I have a thing that I do. I could just do that. And literally I started like that night. I was like, why not just start putting it together? And what I like about it is that when you're writing addiction fiction, sober fiction, you're not beholden to real life. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have the limitations of timelines and inconsistencies in stories. You can just kind of write what you want to write. You can take the themes and take the ideas and put the characters into situations, and you can, tell the story professionally and kind of condense it down and make it a nice, tidy package, which you don't get in real life.
No, not very often.
Yeah. And so I started trying to find other books in the space. And I found a couple that I really liked. And I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. So that was how I got started with it.
And your book is called Killing Hurt. So the title came before, during, after? Like, how did that all come to be? Because the title is interesting. And then, of course, the story explains it a little more.
Yeah, the title actually came like toward the end.
Okay.
And then I actually went back and rewrote part of the book to fit the title.
Okay.
Because I so liked the idea of the title and how it could be a part of the story, but wasn't really at that point.
Okay.
So not obviously the usual, but the idea of it came to me as a theme. And then I went and sort of installed it, which was fairly easy to do because it was already inherent in the story, just to make it a much more relevant title.
So I don't want to tell people about the book because I don't want to give it away. You probably have a much better synopsis that sells it without giving away the interesting parts that come along in it. So go ahead and tell everybody about Killing Hurt so they know what to look for in the story.
Well, I think for the purposes of our conversation, I think it's very much a family story, right? It's a multi-generational, addicted, dysfunctional family. And this story plays itself out over the 3 generations. But the main storyline is the father, Troy, who's a retired cop. He sort of finds himself in one of these stages of life where it's sort of a natural turning point for him in almost every way. His daughters have gone off to school. He's retired from his profession. His long-term relationship just ended. He's just kind of a clean slate.
Mm-hmm.
And he's about 4 years sober at that point. He goes on a surf trip with a couple of sober friends, and they plan to surf great waves and go to AA meetings.
Right.
That's the plan, right? And I've done this. This is my own experience as well.
I wondered, I was going to ask, and I'm like, do I ask? But like the surf piece has to be a part of your story in some way, or no?
Totally.
Okay. Because I couldn't write about surfing to save my life because I've never done it. So I assumed you were in there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's funny you say that because a couple of my friends were like, oh, you wrote a book about yourself, a sober guy who surfs. I'm like, really not at all.
No.
This guy is not like me.
Well, that's good to know because some of what I read, I would hope you hadn't gone through it. That was a lot.
No. So anyway, while he's on this trip, obviously they meet lots of different people, different types of personalities and characters, like you always do in an Alcoholics Anonymous room.
Mm-hmm.
And things go sideways.
Good word.
And he gets hooked up with a sponsor there who he sort of buys into this guy's vibe. Plenty of red flags that he shouldn't buy into this guy's vibe. But again, it's a multi-generational addiction story.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got his daddy issues,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of plays itself out in this relationship. And he ends up falling for it, I guess you would say, again, with this sponsor. And like you said, not to give too much away, but things get pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I wanted to set it up, the main sort of point of it was that he can't literally survive his situation. He can't get out of Central America and live unless or until he deals with his resentments and all the stuff that he hasn't dealt with yet, that he hasn't processed through in his program.
Mm-hmm.
So he went through the steps, he did his fourth and fifth step, but he skipped a bunch of stuff. And so he left work undone, and it almost kills him. Mm-hmm. This is a story that I've heard many times, and I wanted it to play out in a very vivid way for this guy. And so he does. He sorts through his resentments, and I guess I'll spoil the end and say he survives. And like I said, it is a family story. So at the end, the family dynamic in all three generations is changed. Yeah, so that's the gist of it. I'm not sure I did a very good job of explaining that, but
no, you did. And it's interesting because I think in reading it, I was so compelled by his story that I don't know that I fully got the family piece. I did definitely get it at the end, but it was interesting, like to hear you say it now puts in some slots. I think what I took from it with along the lines of you sharing that was what an incredible, strong program your character worked. I mean, he was invested in his recovery. And in recovery, we sometimes meet people who aren't what they say they are. And we have to discern that truth, which is hard because we can get really vulnerable, for lack of a better word. And so I thought that was an interesting twist that you had in there, because I think that is fortuitous for some of us. We can end up connecting with someone who we think is who we need, but yet turns out not to be. But in the big picture of our higher power actually might have been what we needed.
Totally. That's a big theme for me is, not to put anybody on pedestals in recovery. Mm-hmm. We're all drunks. AA is a wonderful place, recommended to anybody, but it is not always a hotbed of mental health. And so you're not in there looking for saviors. You're in there looking for a program.
Right.
The solution is perfect.
Yeah.
The program is perfect. Those people should direct you to the program, direct you to your higher power, but don't start relying on the individuals.
No, I think that's a valid, very good point. I think the other thing is there are people out there who, when they hear you say it's a group of drunks, like, oh, that's such a derogatory word. Oh, yeah. So I'm curious if you'd speak to that. Like, it is not a derogatory word for you, obviously. It's what?
No, it's really not. I'm sorry if people would actually interpret it that way. That's definitely not the way I intended. I say that almost affectionately. When I say a group of drunks, that's one of the ways that we shorten the word God, actually, is group of drunks. So I don't mean that in a negative way at all.
I think that you saying that is very important because, again, the way I frame it, because I hear this quite a bit from lots of different people, whether it be clinicians, whether it be professionals in the field, whether it be people who are not supportive of or are supportive of, is it's what we class ourselves as that matters. It's not what others class us as. I would never even think to call someone that, but I would totally respect if someone called themselves that because that is their journey. It's like coming into a room and people saying, why do I hear people say I'm Margaret and I'm an addict? That's so negative or derogatory. For me, it isn't. It's a reminder that if I forget that piece of who I am, I'm in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important fact. So if you take that as a negative, it's probably going to be a problem for you.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate you saying that. And I also believe in good, orderly direction for God. So we have whatever phrase we say, I'm not a drunk. There by the grace of a higher power, because I'm an equal opportunity addict. It was a control factor for me. Food didn't have that effect, please. It absolutely did. But at the time, I could justify it as being different. My disease masterfully wove the story that I was somehow different than an IV user or an alcoholic because it was a socially acceptable thing to do.
Well, I think a lot of our diseases tell us that we're different. I think that that's probably a common theme, right?
It is. Keeps us there, right? Keeps us stuck.
Exactly.
This podcast is made possible by listeners like you.
I'm excited. I get to come back to Wisconsin. I will be the keynote speaker, which is truly a humbling honor, and a facilitator at the Spiritual Program Retreat's third family program retreat. It's taking place at Camp Waspagassett in Amory, Wisconsin, from Friday, April 12th to Sunday, April 14th. Are you presently in a relationship that has felt the effects of addiction? Has your past been affected by a person with the disease of addiction? Are you seeking a deeper understanding, a community of support, tools to make recovery more concrete? If the disease of addiction has been a family member, this is the retreat for you. Sign up soon. This in-person experience is not one to be missed, and spots are filling up. Find the link in my show notes and learn more about the retreat and how to register to attend and join us at this beautiful camp.
You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast. Can you relate to what you're hearing? Never miss a show by hitting the subscribe button. Now back to the show.
So how long did it take you to write Killing Hurt?
The first draft of it was actually written pretty quickly. I went through it in about 3 months. It was really the rewriting and the editing that took about twice as long as that. I had written some pretty long form, almost like essays, about the characters that in one way, shape, or form made it into the book. And, when editors read that, they were like, okay, it's really good. It's really interesting, but you can't have that in a novel, right? And, I'm a big reader. I know that. So there was a lot of undoing of the telling about the characters and rewriting as, story.
Okay.
And showing about the characters. That took a long time to process.
What was the most challenging part? Was that it? Or was it actually publishing it? What was the hardest part for you?
The hardest part was really getting rid of stuff, to be honest with you, because I got very attached to a lot of this, things that I thought were great and meaningful and important. And an editor goes, get rid of all that. That doesn't help the story. It's besides the point. And I'm like, besides the point? This is the whole reason, and
Sure.
I had other people who are friends of mine read it, who are in the program, who would tell me that there's too much AA in there, and say you have to take into account the fact that not everybody who reads this book is going to be an alcoholic, is going to be in recovery. And so again, just kind of very painful to take some of that out because it's so important to me. So that was really the hardest part, was the paring it down to what's actually in there. And I probably have 2 more books full of stuff.
Good. Something to look forward to.
Yeah. I mean, it's just sitting there.
I am very curious to see where his story goes, especially with his family. I'm hoping that's coming in your next installment.
It's actually not,
Okay.
unfortunately. Sorry.
No, it can be in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Next book is a totally different set of characters, different setting, totally different story. It's addiction fiction. Also, it's a group of drunks who are go through a equally crazy situation. This is in New York, where I live. But then actually the third book, the two sets of characters come together.
Okay.
So I guess somewhere in the future, you'll see Troy again.
So this next one will not include Troy. It will be another group of friends or people in recovery together, but in the city of New York?
Well, a little bit in the city, mostly
Okay.
on Long Island, where I live.
Okay. That's where you live. All right.
Yeah.
So did you have your family read Killing Hurt before it was published, after it was published? Like, how did that happen?
They read it after it was
Okay.
published. I wanted it to be as good as possible. I wanted them to be proud of it. My ego stepped in and said, if they're going to read this, and I hope they will, then I want it to at least be good. So I need some professional help and polish it up and get the editors in there.
Got it.
At the end of it, get all the commas in the right spots and whatnot.
Did you have to go through the adjustment of not having two spaces behind a period?
I'm a big two-space person. So yeah.
That's a learning curve for those of us who are two-space. My kids are like, what? Like, yeah.
You know what? I have 50 years, Margaret, as a two-space after a period guy. And I did manage actually in the editing of this book to finally break that habit.
Good for you.
Thank you for acknowledging how hard that was.
Big learning curve. I'm with you. Oh my gosh. All my stuff I have to constantly remember. No. One space, Margaret, one space. I'm like, when did that change?
I'm not okay with that.
No, it's a big adjustment. You're not okay with the two spaces, but you're okay with being sober, right? Like all the lifting you had to do to get sober, but the two spaces, now that's a little bit much.
It's a little bit of a resentment. I have to work through that, right?
I appreciate that. That's great.
Do a fourth step on that.
Who would be your ideal audience? Like when you thought about writing this, you thought about it because obviously it's a passion of yours, fiction, you're interested, and it ties together your recovery, which you're visibly passionate about. So who's your niche? Who's your perfect audience? Does it matter?
I think it does matter to me. I mean, I have who I'm writing for. If anybody else also enjoys it, all the better. But to me, I'm writing for people who are in recovery. I think anybody who has been through any of the programs that you mentioned, AA, Smart Recovery. I'm a big fan of Buddhist recovery.
Yeah, Refuge.
Oh God, I loved, Refuge back in the day and, the iterations that have followed that.
Yeah.
I think anybody who's in those programs is who I'm writing for. I think that that's who this will resonate with. That's who will identify with the characters and will get the most out of it.
So I'm going to put in a plug for the family side. I think the family side can get a lot out of it. Now, sure, some of it might be way far out of their reality or purview of norm, but I think it would give family an introduction to the healing, the language, the fact that growth in recovery is ongoing, why the value in our loved ones having their communities. So I think you've got an audience there too.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And when I thought about just sort of the commercial side of this, like how big is the audience that you're writing for, literally, I did in my mind include friends and family of people in recovery, because I don't know if that person necessarily would sit down and listen to the same Sandy Beach talk that I listen to on YouTube and think that it's as brilliant and insightful and interesting and useful as I think. I don't know if they'd be able to sit through that, but I do think that they could enjoy this and pull away from it, like you said, a lot of the experience of going through recovery.
If you're in a partnership or a family system where someone's in recovery and they live their recovery out loud around you, but you're not in your own recovery, some of it can sound like a foreign language. But then when you see it in a written form and realize, I'm not talking the big book, but I'm talking about the written form of a novel, you can see how a person can live their life fully in recovery and have a good time in recovery, face challenges through recovery. Like there's a lot of hope in that and a lot of awareness of recovery is a part of every aspect of our life and the value in it.
Absolutely, especially if it's not told as strictly a recovery story. If it's just a good book and it's entertaining, and if you're just a fan of that genre of fiction, then you should be able to enjoy it. And then if you have a family member in recovery, like you said, you have the benefit of that as well.
There were some things Troy went through that I'm like, wow, like I don't think I could survive that. And I thought it must be in your mind as the writer that the ability to survive was absolutely leaning into the principles of recovery in those darkest moments.
Exactly. I mean, that was sort of the concept there, is take you to your lowest possible point. Whatever you think is your lowest point, there's always a trap door below that that'll take you to a lower one. And so when you get there, how strong is your recovery now?
Yeah.
And to your point, he uses his toolkit to make it through that.
I think the other thing that was beautifully portrayed in the book is the power of community. What came through loud and clear was the power of not being in isolation, tapping into recovery and community, but also the tools work if you are in isolation. Does that make sense? Like the whole we of a program being what makes it work.
Yeah, because at one point, we is not available to him, right? In a really terrible way. So what you then have as the we is me and my higher power.
Yeah.
There's still a we that he can lean on at that point.
Yeah. And also the camaraderie and the healing, because families struggle. And I don't know if you experience this in your family, but families often struggle in early recovery when their loved one is in meetings and MIA, if you like, still, but in recovery meetings. And it feels the same to them. Even though you may be changing and coming back differently, it takes a while for that trust to set in. And so what I liked about the book was the window of, can I take a breath as a partner or as a parent or as an adult child? Can I take a breath and go, I don't have to be on duty. I can trust that the person I love has people who are there for them. Because you show that powerfully, the way the network of recovery and the people in Troy's recovery step in for him when needed.
Yeah, I mean, my experience, which I tried to instill into the book, was the more that I invested into the program, the more I got back, right? It's like really like anything else in life, but it was the same for the relationships in the rooms. And I was never, I shouldn't say never, but for the last 5 or 6 years of my drinking, I was not a friend to many people. I had people I hung out with, but my relationships were transactional.
Yep.
And when I got into recovery and my relationships became, when my life depended on those relationships, obviously I invested in them differently that way. And I was much more honest with people, and I had real conversations with people and them with me. And that then becomes, for me, my extended family, right? And I don't have a problem understanding why the core family would find that annoying or threatening. But the flip side of that, to your point, is at least you're not on the hook for this guy the whole time. He's got a support system. He's got people who, at least for this thing, know what they're doing. And I can trust him with them. When he's with them, nothing terrible is going to happen. So I think that's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. And the insecurity of family member also could be that I no longer have the role I played, which I was familiar with, which kept me from my feelings. So that's a whole nother level.
Yeah, that's the whole other side of it. Absolutely.
It is. And the other thing is to understand that for family, it feels like I've been competing with something I couldn't compete with for a long time. And so I think that your addiction fiction offers like taking away that shroud of secrecy and a little bit more knowing of why this is so valuable, and not to be threatened, but to be grateful for and to embrace, realizing that when your loved one goes into recovery, which is what you want more than anything in the world, it's going to feel like they go away again in a ways, but they will come back to you tenfold through the work they do. Join us again next week, where we conclude the conversation. Will dive deeper into his own story of how he wrote Killing Hurt, and we also discuss future projects coming up for him. It's powerful to see how recovery impacts very many areas of our life, all of them, if we're willing to do the work. I want to thank my guest, for their courage and vulnerability in sharing parts of their story. Please find resources on my website, embracefamilyrecovery.com. This is Margaret Swift Thompson. Until next time, please take care of you